Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We will get started in just a moment. Just admitting people from the wait room. All right, I think we should get started. Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Lara Nettelfield, a faculty member here at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. Welcome to our talk with the authors of Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo, which was published by Bloomsbury last month. I was fortunate to read this important book over the summer, and I'm so grateful that the authors have agreed to this discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Kenneth Morrison is professor of modern Southeast European studies at De Montfort University. He's the author of numerous books and articles focusing on the Western Balkans, including Nationalism, Statehood, and Identity in Post-Yugoslav Montenegro, Sarajevo's Holiday Inn on the Front Line of Politics and War, and he's also the co-author of The Sanjak, A History. Paul Lowe is a reader in documentary photography at the London College of Communication, University of the Arts London, and an award-winning photographer and educator living and working between London and Sarajevo. His work is represented by 7 Photo. He's covered breaking news all around the world, including the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Romanian Revolution, the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and the destruction of Grozny. His other books include Photography Rules and A Chronology of Photography. Before I hand over to them, I just want to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the Harriman Institute, the Journalism School, 2 concentrations at the School of International and Public Affairs, the Technology, Media, and Communications concentration, and the Human Rights and Humanitarian Policy concentration. And lastly, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. And finally, a big thank you to Maggie Medley at our institute, who did all of the social media outreach for today's event. Kenneth, I'm going to hand over to you. Could you please start by telling us about how this project came about? You're muted, Kenneth.
Thank you, Lara, for such a wonderful introduction. And yeah, no, I'll be happy to talk about how the book evolved, essentially, how this project evolved. It really goes back to 2013. At the time, I was working on a co-authored history of the Sanjak. And as a consequence, I was kind of coming and going from Sarajevo, and I'd always been fascinated by the Holiday Inn Hotel, because the first time I went to Sarajevo, I realized that the Holiday Inn was, particularly exposed during the siege, and I was always fascinated about how such a building could function under those conditions. And in 2013, I began a project that culminated in a book that was published in 2016. Called Sarajevo's Holiday Inn on the Front Line of Politics and War. For that book, I interviewed, I think it was around about 40 foreign correspondents for that project. And while there was lots of interesting information I garnered about the Holiday Inn from them, I realized that that was only really part of the story. That the story really was the reporting of the siege and how that kind of infrastructure that journalists built and relied upon was created. That was kind of my main interest. So I mentioned it to Paul, I think back in the summer of 2015 or early 2016, that I was thinking of writing this book, and we decided that it would be prudent for us to do this together, to work as a team, to write Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo, or what has become Reporting the Siege of Sarajevo. So it really began as it kind of evolved from the Holiday Inn project, and later a project I worked on with Al Jazeera, a documentary series called War Hotels, in which one episode focused on the Holiday Inn. But so my main focus of my interest was the kind of the infrastructure and how it was created, because really at the beginning, in April 1992, let's say, there was no established infrastructure in the city. Journalists were living in various different hotels or private apartments. They were doing what they could using the limited access to technology that they had, satellite phones, for example. And of course, many freelancers didn't necessarily have access to satellite phones. So that was April 92, but by the end of 1992, by December 1992, let's say, you had this relatively well-established infrastructure. So that was the kind of main focus of my interest, is kind of, assessing, analyzing how that was developed and consolidated. So let's go back to April 1992, and I'm going to show some photographs here if I share my screen with you. Some images here from can you see that, Lara? Can you just confirm that you can? You can, yes. Okay, excellent. So here is of course, the Holiday Inn Hotel. Most of the images that I'll be using were of course, taken by Paul, and we should credit him for that. One of the images, I should also credit Kevin Weaver, the photojournalist, for taking the image of the UN tank outside the TV station. But if we go back to April 1992, the 6th of April 1992, of course, is the day in which you had the shootings from the Holiday Inn. So the peace demonstrators gathered outside the Parliament building across the road, and then SDS snipers firing into the crowd below. Now, after that, the Holiday Inn was closed until June, actually late June 1992. So there was no kind of obvious place for foreign correspondents to assemble in Sarajevo. Most of the foreign correspondents that were there in April and early May, if they were in the city, they stayed in a place called the Hotel Belgrade, which is now the Hotel Bosnia on Kulovica, that most of you well, some of you might be familiar with. Now that hotel was later badly damaged. It was shelled. Some stayed at the Hotel Europa, which those of you that have visited Sarajevo will know the Europa is probably the most famous hotel in the city. That was, of course, damaged by incendiary shells in August 1992. So the journalistic milieu in Sarajevo lived in a number of different places. The Delegates Club, the Hotel Belgrade. The vast majority were not based in Sarajevo itself, they were based in Ilija. So they lived in the hotel complex in Ilija, primarily in the Hotel Bosnia there. But on May the 15th, there was May the 15th, 1992, there was an evacuation from the hotel, or from the hotel complex, because of heavy fighting around it. So the majority of journalists that were staying in that the hotel complex moved down. They left Sarajevo down towards Split, and of course they were no longer in the city. Some stayed behind, a limited number of them, but nevertheless some stayed behind during that time. And those that stayed in late May and early June had to basically make do with various places in which they could live. So private apartments, hotels like the Hotel Belgrade that was still functioning, and the Hotel Europa, although the Hotel Europa by that time was being used to house refugees, IDPs coming from elsewhere. Now, during that time, actually, it was only really local cameramen, some foreign journalists, but primarily local cameramen that were capturing the footage of Sarajevo being shelled, and very heavily shelled, in May and June of 1992. And one, I guess, Western team had a scoop at that time, Sky News. Sky News, unlike many of the other agencies who had been based at the Hotel Bosnia, they were actually based in Belgrade, and they used to drive down, stop in Pale, and then from Pale cross into Sarajevo itself, stay for a few days, do some filming and leave again. During that time, the camera crew that accompanied Arnoud van Linden, who we interviewed for the book, who was part of that Sky, or who led that Sky team, managed to capture some of the most visceral images, actually, of the siege of Sarajevo, particularly the attack, the shelling of the Parliament building across in the Holiday Inn. Now, of course, there was no Holiday Inn to stay in at that time, so the Sky News team basically set up in what's now the Opća Bolnica, the Vojna Bolnica, the military hospital at that time. They agreed with Abdullah Nakash who was the kind of chief surgeon there, to take this one particular room on the 10th floor of that building, and from the 10th floor of that building, they filmed, what was going on in and around the city, and the siege of the city, the shelling of the city at that time. By June, however, the Holiday Inn had reopened. It officially reopened, and if we look at the hotel's guest book, which I will come back to later on, it seems that the first journalists to stay in the Holiday Inn were around about the 21st or 22nd of June. And of course, just a week after that, the airport, Sarajevo airport, was taken over by the UN following Francois Mitterrand's visit to the city. And then more foreign journalists began to come in to Sarajevo. Let me just move this on. So the Holiday Inn thereafter becomes this kind of hub, communications hub within the center of the city. Now, the Holiday Inn, the location, frankly, wasn't terribly favorable because, of course, the Holiday Inn was located not just within siege lines, but really a matter of a few hundred yards away from a front line. So the south-facing part of the Holiday Inn, facing Grbavica, was extremely exposed to sniper fire, for example. So the Holiday Inn ended up playing this very, very important role. And of course, hotels do play important roles in wartime. They sometimes become sort of crucial networking nodes for journalists. They turn into kind of centers for the press. The Holiday Inn, it became, if we think of, for example, the Commodore in Beirut was probably the best example of this. It became a kind of press center. To a slightly lesser extent, the Hotel Europa in Belfast. But the Holiday Inn really became a sort of key part of the infrastructure of reporting in Sarajevo. Now, of course, the Holiday Inn itself had an extremely interesting history, not just from an architectural perspective, because the building was, and anyone that knows Sarajevo knows the Holiday Inn or the former Holiday Inn and knows how architecturally interesting it is. So it has an interesting history from a kind of design perspective. It was designed by Ivan Strauss, a Sarajevan architect, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but left a fantastic legacy of some really amazing late modernist buildings within the city. And then, of course, 1984, it had been the center for the International Olympic Committee, who had stayed there throughout the Winter Olympics. Later, of course, in the early 1990s, the Holiday Inn had become this de facto headquarters of Radovan Karadzić's Serbian Democratic Party. And of course, it was from the Holiday Inn that those shots that I mentioned on the 6th of April 1992 were fired from the Holiday Inn into the crowd of peace demonstrators. So we can say that one of the kind of first, although it wasn't the first, there were the shootings the day before on Verbania Bridge, where Suada Dilberovic and Olga Sucic were killed on the 5th of April. The 6th of April 1992, the shootings in the Holiday Inn really kind of represent the beginning of the siege, although the city wasn't completely encircled until really the 1st and 2nd of May 1992. So the Holiday Inn becomes a really key place. But because of its location, it's very dangerous. It's exposed to mortar and sniper fire, as I mentioned, not only being within siege lines, but being on the most dangerous part of what was called Sniper Alley. So this little corner becomes known as Sniper's Corner and was, exceptionally exposed, exceptionally dangerous place. Of course, you had Grbavica just across the Miljacka River. So again, sniper fire emanating from there is impacting upon the Holiday Inn. Now, not all journalists stayed in the Holiday Inn, I should make that point. There were other hotels operating in Sarajevo, not least the Hotel Hondo and of course the Hotel Belvedere. And the Hotel Belvedere, of course, became the base for Associated Press. Associated Press, one of those agencies that didn't base themselves in the Holiday Inn. So by July 1992, the Holiday Inn had emerged as this kind of key communications hub for foreign journalists and for their local staff. And often local staff who ended up working as stringers or translators or fixers would go to the Holiday Inn to be interviewed before actually beginning their work, working for foreign journalists or for foreign agencies. The area around the Holiday Inn was also particularly difficult. And Paul might talk about this a little bit when we talk about one of the interesting aspects of the Siege of Sarajevo was the armorization of journalism. Journalists using armored cars as opposed to soft-skin cars, which would, of course, you were very vulnerable driving around in one of these. Throughout the winter of 1992 and 1993, more and more journalists began driving armored cars around Sarajevo. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is because it was so hazardous. And in and around the Holiday Inn, guests were generally advised not to walk around the exposed areas of the hotel because you were in sight of the positions on the surrounding hills. So you were at a serious risk of being targeted in the immediate environs of the Holiday Inn. Entrance and exits into the building was generally by the back door or by the basement garage if you had transport. And the basement garage of the Holiday Inn was filled with armored cars, some soft skins, but with no armored plating, all with the letters TV taped or painted across the front, and sometimes with the logos of their agencies painted on them. So I don't think we can underestimate the important role that the Holiday Inn played within besieged Sarajevo. It was a very, very important communications hub for journalists, if they could afford to stay there, because of course it wasn't cheap staying in the Holiday Inn. Then the Sarajevo TV station was also a very important part of the infrastructure used by foreign correspondents. That infrastructure, of course, of the Sarajevo TV station existed before. The building began, or the so-called Sivi Dome, or the Grey House, the building of it began in the 1960s. It wasn't finished until, or completed. There was a new annex built just prior to the 1984 Winter Olympics. But it was a really important part of the infrastructure used by the Foreign Press Corps. And really the majority of reports, particularly, of course, the images that we've become familiar with of the Siege of Sarajevo were filed from here. Now, this building was among the most, it was, let's say, one of the least aesthetically pleasing, but certainly one of the most robust buildings in Sarajevo. It was, solidly constructed, designed, in fact, to repel or be defended against attacks. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that it wasn't targeted, because the TV station was targeted on numerous occasions, but it didn't meet the same fate as the nearby Oslobođenje building, for example. Now, it was thought to be one of the most secure buildings in the city, but of course, it came under fire on numerous occasions. And the worst of those attacks came on the morning of 28th of June, 1995, Vidovdan, when a large explosion caused by an improvised or modified air bomb was fired by the Bosnian Serb army from Ilija, killing one person in the building and injuring tens of others of local and international journalists working in the building. Now, the TV station became really a very important communications hub, like the Holiday Inn. Now, it was important because it was the kind of main transmission point used by international media organizations. So the EBU had originally established a satellite feed point in the Hotel Ilija in April. But when the journalists decided to leave en masse the Ilija Hotel complex in the middle of May 1992, they left that equipment behind. And actually, much of that equipment ended up in the hands of the Bosnian Serbs, who used it to create their own kind of TV station. So the EBU basically had to go back into Sarajevo in mid-June 1992. There was a so-called special operations team led by a woman called Miriam Schmaus, who went back into the city to establish a feed point, a satellite feed point within the TV station itself. So that was one of the reasons, well, the core reason why, certainly in the early days, that this was the most, or one of the most important parts of that infrastructure. So different TV crews, journalists and print journalists would use the facilities of the EBU, whether they were editing or doing satellite feeds of film, dictation using satellite phone. There were some satellite phones in the Holiday Inn, but there was far more, there was a bigger infrastructure within the TV station. So the BBC had an office there, which they shared with ABC News, CNN, ABC, ZDF, Germany, Channel 1 from France, ARD also from Germany, Associated Press, TV News, WTN, all of these organizations were based within the TV station. But it really was the EBU operation that was most important there. Essentially, it was a means of transmission from A to B, and it was really vital. Other agencies used this to transmit pictures or transmit stories by satellite phone. And it should be said that one of the interesting things about this project, when we were developing this project and when we started doing the research into it, was assessing how technology changed significantly between 1992 and 1995. And the satellite phones, for example, the Inmarsat satellite phones that journalists were using in 1992 were primarily for voice. They could transmit some data, but very, very slowly. But we begin to see actually by 1994, 1995, portable satellite phones, for example, becoming much smaller, and the possibilities for digital transmission becoming much greater. So, the TV station, an extremely important part of that infrastructure. The final important part of the infrastructure, and I haven't mentioned Sarajevo Airport or any of the other kind of buildings that journalists would use as part of the infrastructure or frequent, but of course, Sarajevo Airport was also extremely important part of that. The PTT building is where UNTRAFOR, United Nations Protection Force, were based. They had one floor of that building. They moved in March 1992. They left in May 1992, although they later returned. The majority of UN personnel in the early days of the siege were housed in the Dom Pensionera, which the UN staff referred to as the Hotel Rainbow, because of its kind of colourful exterior. But of course, that building had been really badly damaged in June 1992. So after they returned, they established a base in the PTT building. So initially it was just the 7th floor, but they kind of start to move through the floors of the PTT and inhabit that whole building by June 1992. It wasn't ideal because it possessed a large glass facade. It was also quite exposed, like the Holiday Inn. And it was not immune in any way from shelling and sniping. Part of the building, the PTT building, of course, faced south towards VRS lines, the Army of Bosnia, the Army of Republika Srpska. So UNTRAFOR staff preferred to work and sleep in those offices that were in the north of the building. Now, one of the daily rituals of the Foreign Press Corps in Sarajevo was the UN briefings. They were held there almost every day, unless there was, particularly heavy fighting taking place in the city. Now, these briefings were dubbed the 9 o'clock follies, which of course was a play on the so-called 5 o'clock follies given by the US Army Command in Saigon during the Vietnam War, which would always take place in the Rex Hotel in central Saigon. Now, these meetings between the press corps and the UN could often be rather fractious affairs. And of course, the journalists gathered there would often be kind of, deeply critical of the role of the UN. Though I have to say, in all our interviews, there was an acknowledgement from all of those journalists that we interviewed, is that while the UN as an organization may not have been doing what they should have in Sarajevo, they sympathized with the people that were on the ground trying to work with what was a very ambiguous and problematic mandate. And the PTT building was also the termination point for a shuttle service that UNTRAFOR ran by Armoured Personnel Carrier, APC, to and from the airport. Now, those that wished to use this service, of course, had to register. They had to have a press card, and you had to submit the relevant paperwork if you wanted to be allowed to use this service. Now, initially, this service and the flights in and out of Sarajevo from the airports were used by foreign correspondents, those that had press cards. UNTRAFOR staff, aid workers, foreign correspondents, all of these people could use those flights, provided they had the appropriate UN press accreditation. For local staff, at the beginning, it was a different story. They couldn't leave the city, even for some respite. And of course, this became a matter of concern for the foreign journalists, many of whom were relying really heavily on their local staff. one really interesting development that took place in late 1992. The Sarajevo International Journalists Association was formed. It was an ad hoc organization, no permanent membership and no constitution, but it acted as a kind of union lobbying the UN for allowing local staff who were working with foreign journalists to be able to leave the city for short periods of rest and recuperation. And after that, actually, the UN allowed for local staff who were working with foreign agencies to be given a so-called UN blue card, which allowed the local staff to fly in and out of the city and to be transported from the airport to the PTT building in an Untitled APC. So those were just three of the kind of key buildings that we were writing a lot about in the book, the infrastructure that journalists use while reporting the siege. Now, of course, foreign correspondents were documenting developments on a daily basis, and in order to be able to do that, to allow such work to be executed effectively, a journalistic infrastructure had to be developed, and it gradually developed. And this is one of the things that we describe in the book. And that made it possible for them to effectively navigate the besieged city, but also to report from there. So they could send either by satellite phones or using the EBU's feed point, daily news reports. Now, doing so was a really significant logistical and technological endeavor that involved journalists, their local staff, producers, fixers, satellite engineers, electricians, and many others. And they did this in the most challenging of circumstances. So the reporting of the siege was made possible through significant entrepreneurship in the most difficult of conditions and a genuine commitment to the story. Many of the foreign correspondents really aided the consolidation of the infrastructure because the story mattered to them, and getting it out there to the wider world mattered to them. But of course, it couldn't have been achieved without that existing infrastructure. Much of it going back to the 1984 Sarajevo Olympics, Winter Olympics, the Holiday Inn, the TV station. Much of that infrastructure was there. It just had to be kind of repurposed, if you like, for the reporting of the siege. So that's, I think, a good point for me to pass on to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit more about the experience of individual journalists during the siege and how they functioned in the city during that period. I would say that two things before I finish. Two things that this book is not. This book is not a book about journalistic daring do in a particular context. And it's not also a history of the siege. The siege is the kind of broader context within which these foreign correspondents were doing their job. So it's primarily a book about reporting rather than a history of the siege. But Paul, I'll pass it on to you now.
Thanks, Kenneth. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and amazing to see so many people here, particularly people who are actually in the book, but incredible to welcome everybody to today, almost 200 people, and a little bit intimidating that many people that we've interviewed and featured in the book are actually in the room with us. So that's really pretty amazing and wonderful to see you all here. Let me just get my presentation up. So I'm going to talk a little bit in some ways about the, let me just get the slideshow going. Why Sarajevo is kind of important in the history of journalism, really, because I think the 1990s is a really important decade, because I think it's a very transitional decade between kind of analog and digital, between almost old school legacy mainstream media and the new digital platforms. And it was a sort of generational shift as well for a lot of new reporters who came up during that period, which sort of starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Romanian Revolution, which I covered as a young photographer, and then moving through Slovenia, Croatia, and on to Bosnia. So when I first went to Bosnia, like quite a lot of people of my generation, sort of late 20s, early 30s, in some ways it was kind of our war. I mean, obviously there were amazing people like John Burns and who'd covered all sorts of other incredible conflicts, but it was our Beirut, our Lebanon, our Vietnam almost. But when I first went to Sarajevo, like quite a lot of us, we'd covered the conflict in Slovenia, the conflict in Croatia. So Bosnia was kind of the next domino. And we've been hearing a lot before the conflict started, that it was never going to happen in Sarajevo because Sarajevo was too multi-ethnic, too multi-this, too multi-that, too mixed. And conflict there was simply unimaginable because it was so integrated. But sadly, obviously, that wasn't the case. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the geography of the city, but just to give you some sense of the location, how close the front lines were and how dominant the Serbian forces were around the city. This is a post-war map, obviously, but more or less bang in the middle there is the Holiday Inn that Kenneth has been talking about. And I always sort of thought of it a little bit like a medieval fortress, sort of sitting like a castle. And it actually sat in a very strategic position in the city because it was halfway, more or less, between New Sarajevo, where a lot of the residential areas were, and the old town and the parliament and the old sort of Ottoman center of the city. So actually, although it was very exposed, because it was kind of semi-protected in many ways, it actually operated as a really valuable fulcrum or location for journalists to work out of. And so, as I said, for a lot of us, this was this kind of domino effect of, you know, the collapse of Yugoslavia after the fall of Tito. And a lot of us were really, you know, we came to this story, I suppose, in a sense, like any other story, you know, it's an incredible human interest story. But what a lot of us were really fascinated by, and certainly myself, was this idea of taking a European capital city full of educated, very cosmopolitan, very intelligent people, and essentially taking them back to the Middle Ages. You know, no electricity, no gas, no water. How would you survive? How would you actually live? What would you do to try to make sense of this? You know, how would you find ways to live, to survive, and in strange ways even to prosper? So I think we were really captured by the incredible emotional power of this story. And I think for many of us, it resonated as sort of something that, you know, you could imagine this happening in Edinburgh or Bristol or any other sort of European city, because if it could happen in Sarajevo, it could almost happen anywhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of some of the things that happen in terms of journalism that I think are very important in Sarajevo. That Sarajevo kind of stands in as it's not the only place these things happen, but I think it's a very good case study of some of these changes that were happening. I think one of the really interesting things that happened was the camaraderie and the collaboration. This is the lobby of the Holiday Inn. That's David Reef talking there with another reporter. And this sense of telling the story together, you know, sharing information. You know, there was a really important moment, for example, where, you know, basically people realized, particularly the TV crews realized, it was far too dangerous to all be chasing the same story. So they set up the Sarajevo Agency Pool as a collaborative space where they could share footage to reduce the risk of everybody having to go out every day to report and so on. So there was a lot of collaboration. I mean, obviously people had their own stories, their own ideas, they were chasing down their own leads. But within that, you know, the Holiday Inn was a place where you would come, you could sit in the lobby, you could find out what was going on, you could share information, you could, you know, decompress a little bit as well, and you could get resources, including obviously, you know, the generated electricity, food. This is Janine Giovanni talking with Jonathan Landy. But it was a very surreal atmosphere in the hotel. Because, you know, the hotel kept running, obviously, all the way through the war. They kept serving food. Admittedly, the quality wasn't incredible, but it was hot and it was reasonably nutritious. This is Michael Montgomery and Charlotte Eager. And it was obviously quite surreal to be sitting in the hotel with the windows covered in plastic, with shelling going on outside and being served soup by a waiter in a bow tie. So there was that sense of camaraderie and that sense of kind of a new generation of reporters, a lot of whom had set themselves up as stringers, reporting from places in Eastern Europe after the sort of fall of the Berlin Wall. And then they'd sort of cut their teeth, as it were, in that early period of the 90s, and then moved on to Sarajevo as the next kind of big story that we were covering, which was really kind of, so they were sort of really establishing their reputation. It really did help make the reputation of a lot of reporters. So I think the other thing I think that, as Kenneth alluded to, it marks a really important technological shift as well in reporting, because it is essentially the period where analog moves over into digital. So the digital only really comes in towards the end of the Siege of Sarajevo. It's more, you know, by the end of the Kosovo conflict, for example, when photographers are no longer having to develop film in the bathroom of the hotel and transmit it over a huge sat phone and a separate wire machine. But it does mark the period when these relatively lightweight computers and sat telexes and cameras came to the fore, which obviously massively sped up the process by which reporters could get their stories out. So this is the famous Tandy computer that was very valuable in Sarajevo because it ran off AA batteries. So even when there was no power, you could still keep on going and filing your stories. But there was a bit of a flip side to this technological advance, in the sense that it also brought with it the rolling news, the sort of CNN, BBC rolling news. And although that meant obviously that you know, the news was very up to date, there was a danger in that, the tyranny of the live feed. For example, we talked to Martin Dawes, who said that, you know, there was one particular moment during a NATO airstrikes when he wasn't actually able to leave the hotel to go out to report on what was happening outside, because he was constantly being called to do a live two-way on the different BBC platforms of radio and television. So although, you know, this ability to transmit almost directly from the field was really powerful, it did sometimes mean that actually journalists couldn't get out and do the job of actually reporting and actually telling the story. As Kenneth alluded to as well, it also marks this really important point of the armorization and the professionalization of security of journalists. You know, when we first went there, you know, we weren't wearing flak jackets, we weren't wearing helmets. You had to get a flak jacket to get on the UN plane. So that was one reason why people started to do that. But we were all driving soft cars. Jeremy Bowen may remember this car. It was a BBC staff Carlton, Vauxhall Carlton, which was just part of the BBC fleet of cars during, you know, before the war. And Alan Heyman, who was an incredible character that everybody who was ever there will remember, was the BBC fleet manager. And he drove out a lot of these cars to Bosnia. So we started off as like this in basically normal soft cars with TV written on them. But actually, Alan, I think, was the first person to build an armored car out there. And there were a whole series of BBC armored cars that were then brought in with various nicknames like Miss Piggy and Winnie the Pooh and so on. And Alan Little, who I think is also with us tonight, gave us a great quote about how at the early stages of the war, when the first BBC armoured Land Rover came in, it looked exactly like the BBC radio Land Rover, except the BBC one wasn't armoured. And they were worried that the Serbs might start sniping at the armoured one and then mistake the armoured one for the non-armoured one, and end up hitting the BBC crew. So they were there was a certain amount of kind of armour jealousy, if you like, almost. And we also tell a fantastic story of how Gary Knight set himself up not only as an incredible photojournalist, but also as a businessman. And he bought an armoured car in Britain and shipped it over to Bosnia and then started renting it out, and made a really amazing sideline in sort of dealing. And he became actually one of the only journalists ever to have an arms exporter's license, because in order to buy an armoured car in Britain, you had to be registered as an arms dealer. So not only was he a great photographer, he was also a licensed arms dealer. Obviously, one thing we also have to really pay tribute to is all of the journalists who were wounded and killed in Bosnia. And sadly, obviously, Kurt Shorky was killed after that. But, you know, it really did take its toll on the civilian population of the city, but also on the journalists, both local and international, who covered the story. And that's obviously a really significant thing to bear in mind as well. But I think what really drew us as journalists to the story was this incredible sense of just trying to understand how people could survive in this incredibly difficult situation. It was the kind of the most human of human interest stories, if you like. And different journalists found their own ways of working with that. Charlotte Eager, for example, kind of adopted a family there and would go back and visit them regularly, and they became friends. You know, I think that was one of the really extraordinary things about covering the story. I made incredible friends there, lifelong friends, covering how people were trying to live their daily lives there. And so I think some of the most important reporting that came out was this sense of living with people, spending time with them, following them over a period of time, which meant the readers of newspapers could also begin to identify with these characters. It wasn't just, you know, a person who was only featured in the story once. They would be featured multiple times over many weeks and months and even years. One of the other incredible things about this story as well was the way that art and culture played a role in the resistance. So it wasn't just people fighting on the front lines and then people sort of scrabbling for food and diving for cover. The city of Sarajevo used its civic values as part of the resistance against the aggression. So you still had impromptu concerts by the Sarajevo String Quartet, you had art galleries opening, you had the film festival happening, and obviously some very high profile people came in as well, like Susan Sontag to direct Waiting for Godot, the theatre play, which was, you know, rehearsals, and the play was conducted by candlelight. So we cover a lot of that aspect as well, of the sort of how the cultural resistance of the city was so significant in its survival as well. So as I said, I think really, you know, as a journalist, it was this incredibly powerful story that was there every single day. But there were certain routines that we developed as well, because, you know, after a while, you know, it was pretty clear that certain situations were happening very regularly. So sniping, there were certain intersections in the city which were regularly sniped and where people would regularly be crossing. So you would have photographers and TV crews basically waiting for people to run across the street to get these dramatic images. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Some days you would literally go cruising, driving around the city, waiting to see if something happened. If a shell would land, you would hear the explosion, you would drive towards it, try and photograph the aftermath. And indeed, journalists very often would take people in their cars after attacks directly to the hospital. Obviously the hospital, the Kosovo and the French hospitals were also real focal points for the journalists, you know, because it was an incredible story. The skill of the surgeons there, saving people's lives, rebuilding people's bodies, was an incredible human narrative that people could follow. And so these became locations where you would go on a kind of regular basis, really. And obviously also things like funerals. Funerals were often held at night because it was so dangerous. They were being targeted by the Serb forces in the mountains and the hills above. But obviously there was kind of ritual of going, when you would hear of a particularly severe incident or a dramatic incident, you would go and photograph the funeral afterwards. And the morgue as well. I mean, we've got some extraordinary material about how it was to go into the morgue on a daily basis to count the numbers of dead and to ascertain, to make sure that the figures were accurate. And obviously going there to photograph and film what was these really horrific scenes of the victims of the aggression. And then, you know, as I said, there was some really iconic images that came out of the conflict, but ones that are also very troubling. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because it is a really horrific image. But that was obviously the body of Nermin Divovic, a young 7-year-old boy who was shot in November 1994 by a sniper, and the bullet passed through the body of his mother, who was trying to cross an intersection, going through his head and killing him pretty much on the spot. And that picture is by Enrique Marti of AP. And so we talk a lot in the book as well about some of the ethical issues that faced photographers and journalists covering these things, about how do you photograph trauma, how do you photograph suffering, how do you work with these incredibly emotionally charged stories. And the other big thing really that I'll finish on, I think, and then we'll open up for some questions, is the big question mark that the conflict in Bosnia raised. Is in many ways it was a challenge to the sort of the assumption that as a journalist, if you tell the story then to the world will then do something about it. Because the narrative that was coming out predominantly from the media that were working in Sarajevo was that this was a war of aggression. There was a very clear party that was besieging the city, that was essentially in the wrong, and was massively outnumbered in both weapons and equipment and soldiers, and was besieging the city. And it wasn't the ancient ethnic hatreds that had been sort of peddled, or that idea that was being pushed forward by the embassies and the governments predominantly of the West, and predominantly America, Britain and France. So that we were pushing one narrative, but the political narrative was pushing back against that. And we were calling for intervention. To a lot of journalists on the ground, it seemed that it was a prima facie case of aggression and potentially even genocide. And I remember sitting in the Holiday Inn with some of the colleagues, even in this room, arguing, can we call this genocide? What's the definition of genocide? How can we, what can we do about this? And essentially that didn't happen, because, despite all the incredible reporting, despite the incredibly powerful pictures, intervention didn't come until many, many years after the start of the conflict. So in a way, it was a challenge to that fundamental tenet of journalism that, you know, you're telling the story and somebody will listen, somebody will do something about it. And that led quite a lot of reporters, and obviously chiefly Martin Bell, to articulate this idea of the journalism of attachment, or this idea effectively that in the face of a war crime or a genocidal attack, that trying to be balanced and giving both sides a fair shot at the argument is morally wrong. You know, that you have to, you know, you still judge the facts, you still look at the truth of what's happening, if as far as you can ascertain that. But if that is pointing towards accusing one side of being an aggressor and of carrying out war crimes, then you call that out and you say, you know, action should be taken. So I think there's a really interesting, that's one of the really interesting shifts, I think, that the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and particularly the Siege of Sarajevo, marks, which is a sort of shift, perhaps in some cases, from conventional sort of inverted commas objective journalism, which as we know doesn't really exist, but anyway, towards something more like advocacy. And I think it's actually quite interesting from that perspective how many of the reporters that covered the conflict have actually ended up moving into the humanitarian era. So people like Emma Daly going to Human Rights Watch, Martin Dorr going to UNICEF, Sean Maguire, I think, is with us tonight, you know, going to the Red Cross, and then on to other NGOs and so on. And I think, you know, it's a very interesting question as to how that worked and how that happened. And then obviously also it did launch, you know, it was an incredible story to cover, and it did launch the careers of a whole generation of young reporters like myself who then went on to do some extraordinary reporting after that as well, because it didn't stop, you know, it went on through Kosovo. And then obviously, then we move into, I think, a very different kind of conflict with the Gulf Wars, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, and obviously now with Syria. And I think I'll finish on that quote that Sean Maguire gave us, which was really fantastic. And, you know, I interviewed Sean quite late in the process of the book. It was one of the final interviews that we'd done when we were working on the conclusion. And he said that, you know, this was, in many ways, this wasn't the first of the new wars. It was kind of the last of the old ones. It was one of the last old school journalism stories before, you know, when we move into the 20th century, a lot of the rules change when, you know, although there were moments when journalists were definitely targeted in Sarajevo and obviously, you know, were killed even, by and large, we could still operate as journalists. We could cross the front lines, we could work on both sides, we could report relatively freely, we weren't censored and so on and so forth. Nobody was, you know, there were some instances of people being kidnapped, but it wasn't on the scale and the way that it is now, where journalism is as much a target, if not more, than many other people who are operating in these kind of situations. So I think as a case study, first of all, as an incredible human story, and there's a story, as Kenneth said, about the logistics of journalism. It's also a very important sort of turning point in many ways, I think, in how journalism has progressed and how journalism moved forward from that period. So yes, I'd just like to thank again Kenneth for working this. I'd like obviously to thank Lara for inviting us tonight. It's fantastic. And to thank all of you for coming this evening and hopefully joining us in some really interesting conversation and some discussion now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Kenneth. I'll start off with a quick question. Can you speak a little bit about the interviews you did for the book, how you decided, who you decided to interview, and had these individuals been asked about their experience before during the war? There's a lot of journalism students and a lot of students of human rights in the audience, so many of them are just starting out on their first research projects.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to talk to that question. We wanted to make the almost 100 people that we interviewed for the book a representative sample, or as representative as it could be. So, of course, we interviewed, you know, people who are, many of whom are very esteemed, well-known journalists, Pulitzer Prize winners. But we also wanted to ensure that we were interviewing local staff, stringers, drivers, translators, fixers, satellite engineers. We wanted to interview freelancers, you know, people, as Paul alluded to at the beginning. There were so many of the journalists that covered the Siege of Sarajevo were young. And they didn't necessarily, although they later acquired kind of status as, you know, staff with a particular newspaper or agency, you know, they went there with some with very little experience. Some were just out of university, and this was their first piece of journalistic work that they did. So we wanted to make it as representative as possible, because the reality is that this story wasn't just covered by the big journalists and the big agencies. It was covered by local cameramen, particularly if we're talking about, for example, Paul mentioned the Sarajevo agency pool. Some of the most visceral images of the Siege of Sarajevo were taken by local cameramen. So it was important that we didn't end up writing a book that just kind of gave the impression that this was a story reported by a small elite of journalists. It wasn't. It required a significant collaboration between people who had no experience of war at all and those that had significant experience of it. The other thing I'll say about the interviews is that the interviews were quite unlike any interviews I've ever done in the past, because in my past work, I've tended to interview political elites who are very, they know what you're going to ask. They have a kind of set of responses that they're going to give you, and they're not going to go beyond certain parameters. Some of the interviews that we did were very long, so they might last 2 or 3 hours. And they were almost, I think, a catharsis for some of those we interviewed, because of course, many of the more senior journalists have been asked about this many, many times. But for some of those who left journalism quite quickly thereafter, their stories have never been told. And sometimes these were they weren't just expressing their work in Sarajevo. They were expressing what they experienced and the psychological impact that had upon them. So, the interviews, although we have, of course, established semi-structured interviews and ethical parameters within which we have to work, some of the interviews were extremely revealing and actually exceeded my expectations in terms of of what people were willing to discuss and the impact that it had upon their professional and personal lives. But maybe Paul,
can I just add some? Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really interesting point that Kenneth made, that people really opened up. And I think because a lot of what we were interested in, and particularly I was interested in, was process. How do you actually write? How do you actually find stories? What do you actually do in the field? So Charlotte Eager, for example, and this picks up on Kenneth saying, a lot of us just come out of university. She had a fantastic quote about Sarajevo actually being like being back at Oxbridge, where you had a weekly essay to write, except, you're writing, you're interviewing people instead of reading books to do your research. And the lecture theatre, instead of going to the lecture theatre every day, you went to the UN briefing, and, you had to write an essay every week. So it was, little gems like that really gave an insight into the process and the mindset of reporters as well, about how they work. Because I think that's one of the things we wanted to do, was open up the journalists as people as well, because often journalists are sort of, there's this kind of almost like invisible, open the fourth wall a little bit, because at the end of the day, reporters are reporting. And I think, I always think it's quite extraordinary that, by and large, most reporters, it's changing now, arguably, but, predominantly white, predominantly Western, predominantly male, predominantly university educated, predominantly liberal, by and large, particularly, I think, in conflict reporting. And so we're quite a narrow focus group through which all this incredible news gets filtered and sort of pushed back out again into the world, if you like. And we wanted to kind of open up a little bit of the characters of some of these journalists as well, and to really let them tell their stories. And also, obviously, there's quite a lot of material out there in the public domain. A lot of people wrote really excellent books, memoirs about their experiences of Bosnia and other conflicts. And have written incredibly honestly. I think one of the other things that was really powerful is that several journalists have either written openly or discussed with us, the effect that this has had on them with PTSD and how it's haunted them even to this day. So there's some really, really painfully honest stories in there as well, which are really powerful. Obviously at the end of the day, journalists, we do have a ticket home. We're not, we have to take that into account, but there is a price to be paid in that as well.
Thank you, Paul. If you could just use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you. The first question, I will hand it off to Jim Dingeman.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Kenneth and Paul. I was just curious to both of you, this conflict is occurring at the same time in the aftermath of the Gulf War, which is an extremely media, government managed war. And I always was struck when I talked to friends of mine who were covering the conflict in Sarajevo. It always reminded me of Madrid in 1936, sort of a modern version of that. And I wonder what thoughts you have, because we know that the imagery, the content, the messaging out of conflicts, starting from the Gulf War ever since, have been extremely managed. And you seem to be have operated in a different kind of situation. I was wondering what thoughts you have in reflection about that.
Well, it was managed to an extent. I mean, an extent you could do whatever you wanted, but it was still managed. So, for example, getting to the front lines involved an enormous amount of paperwork because, relatively quickly the Bosnian government set up, a structure, and so you had to get a press pass, and you had to get, one of the fascinating details we recorded was, that you would get the local fixer would have to go to the Bosnian ministry. To the press representative there and get a paper that would allow them to travel through the various checkpoints to get to the front lines on a very specific date for a very specific time period with a very specific crew of people. So there was some kind of management, if you like, and there was a lot of management on if journalists went to the RS side, crossing over onto the Serbian side again of being sort of shepherded around and having a minder and so on. Having said that, you could literally walk around the streets and interview people and talk to them and find them very, very easily. So there was a sense of openness and a sense of freedom, if you like. I think it's tricky because the whole kind of embedded journalism of the 2000s and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've got people in the room who can probably speak even more to this from their own personal experience, in a way is, I'm not saying it's an anomaly, but it's a different kind of space and a different kind of reporting space than it was in Sarajevo. But I'm not saying that's the way it always has to be in the future. I think there are moments when journalists can still break away from that kind of government imposed narrative and the minders and so on and so forth. But there was certainly a sense with Sarajevo where, every corner had a story. Every person anybody you stopped to talk to would have an incredible story. I think, again, Charlotte talks about that, how you could, every time you began, the way she found the family that she ended up spending so much time with was she was looking for somebody else, and she knocked on somebody's door and in an apartment and said, can you help me? And they asked her in, and then her whole, the rest of her kind of story in Sarajevo changed completely because she'd found this incredible family. So it was you were able to do that still relatively freely in Sarajevo.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add to that, I mean, I think one of the interesting things, I mean, you mentioned the Gulf War and how, managed, I mean, journalists, those that were in Baghdad, and there weren't that many of them, but if we think about, for example, the CNN team, Peter Arnett and his team, they were still under surveillance, essentially, by the Iraqi government. It was possible in Sarajevo to drive into the city, not without significant risk, of course, but even before the airport opened, after that agreement that was brokered on the 28th of June, 1992, you could still move in and out of the city with relative ease. I mean, as Paul mentioned, there was a bureaucracy behind it. So there was a kind of bureaucracy that you had to deal with. You had to fill out papers and have all of the right paperwork in order to be able to cross checkpoints. But the relative freedom that journalists had in Sarajevo is in stark contrast to the kind of reporting that was possible during the first Gulf War. And of course, this is where I think it was Robert Fisk that coined the term hotel journalism, which became, kind of during the first Gulf War. There were a few journalists in Baghdad, but, the vast majority were actually reporting from, the roof of their hotel in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. So I think it was, in a sense, although many of the experienced journalists who had covered the Middle East for long periods didn't experience that in Sarajevo because they weren't there. Because I think for a long time there was a perception that a war, the kind of war that you might see in the Middle East or Africa, couldn't happen in Europe. And I wondered if the bigger, the established war correspondents weren't necessarily attracted to Bosnia because they couldn't imagine that something like that could happen in Europe. And, you know, I remember speaking to Alan Little about this, and Alan saying, you know, by the time that the bigger hitters wanted to be involved, the younger guys were already experts. They knew what was going on. They'd established themselves. So Sarajevo was very interesting from that perspective as well. That it gave a younger generation of journalists an opportunity that they may not have had otherwise. And, you know, some wonderful journalists now who are, of course, very well established journalists cut their teeth in Sarajevo.
Thank you, Kenneth. Jeremy Bowen.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's been a terrific presentation. I've really, really enjoyed it. And, you know, for those of you who don't know me, I was in Sarajevo throughout the war. And I now work in the Middle East. And I was in fact, I was interested to hear that you mentioned the Gulf War of '91, because I was in Baghdad for that. And certainly compared to Baghdad, there was an immense amount of freedom to move around during the war in Bosnia. At the time, we didn't think it was very free at all, but in retrospect, it really, really was. You know, I've been to Syria a lot in recent years since the war, well, God, 10 years. And it's unbelievably much, much, much more difficult to work in Syria than it ever was in Sarajevo and in Bosnia in general. In Bosnia, you could get into your, well, you saw the picture of our car that we had to start with, but later on when we had various kinds of armored vehicles, you could, you know, think, well, where should we go today? And to get out of the city was an issue. It would take a while to arrange it, as Paul has said. I went to Mostar in 1993 and walked over the mountains from Jablanica. And, you know, that journey from Sarajevo to Mostar, which these days you can go by car, and I think about an hour and a half or something. It took us, just to get to Jablanica, it took us 2 days. Then it was a long walk over the mountains and a very problematic exit from the city as well. So it was a different kind of thing, but the point was you could do it. And I, you know, so I look back, this for me is quite a nostalgia fest, because my God, the constraints we work under now are enormous compared to it. I think there's another factor too, which is that regimes are way more media savvy than they were back then. And I think as a result of that, they look at us much more closely. We're a kind of slight irritant, I think, around the edges. You know, there'd be all the rituals, no doubt you go into them in the book, which I'd love to see, you know, crossing over and going to Parle and going to the press center, and, you know, Sonia Karadzic, who would never be awake before 2 in the afternoon, and you know, that sort of stuff. You go and get a good served lunch, and then Bosnian served lunch, and then you have to go back into the city, which was always much more welcoming. And, you know, the point was we can move around. And, you know, now, I mean, for example, I haven't got a visa for a couple of years, but if I was to go to Damascus, which I worked out of quite a lot, I mean, when we used to drive up to Aleppo, my God, the trouble it took. And even though there were times when I've been able to work relatively freely there, it's under a lot of surveillance. So yeah, it was, in retrospect, a bit from journalism's point of view, I'd say a bit of a golden age. And a lot of us who were young then, I think, look back on it as that now, probably. I would have reported the story differently. I was texting earlier on with Alan Little, who I see down in one of the little boxes here. I was texting with him, and we both said, I hope you won't mind me revealing this, that, you know, I think if we knew what we know now, we might have reported it differently. But we were youngsters. Alan and I had both been in Baghdad.
Jeremy?
I'd have got more into the politics. I was more interested in the horror of the conflict, right, and stories about people being killed. And I think that the risk, what I've learned over the years, particularly working in the Middle East, is that you need as well the political context. You know, why is it happening? Otherwise, if you're not careful, even though you might, as a reporter, be passionately attached to the story, as certainly I was, my God, it was my obsession. It was my whole life going there. And I hated not being there. And I, when I was back in London at times, I felt like I was in the wrong place. And it was, I think that the problem was that if you just give people as journalists a diet of, slaughter and go looking for it, and which of course you need, particularly if you're in the visual side of things, then it can become a bit like white noise. And so, there, oh my God, there's that bloke banging on about Bosnia again. I lost count of the number of people in that era who'd say to me things like, Jeremy, I'm really a news junkie, but my goodness me, when you come on, I go make a cup of tea. I just cannot deal with any more of this stuff coming from that bloody country. And why the hell is it all happening? And so I think that if I had, in my own reporting, plugged in more into the politics of it, yes, have all the visual horror of the whole thing, which was part of it. But then, and what I'm trying to do now in my reporting many years on, is to build into my script, not just here's an awful thing that's happened, but here's an awful thing that's happened, and this is why it's happened, and try and make it into more of a sort of seamless web. And that, anyway, is, I'll shut up at this point, but anyway, it's good to see a lot of familiar faces, and I haven't seen for some years, and to talk about these issues, which, were such a big part of our lives at the time. And I think for all of us who were there, it was a massively formative experience. It was for me, because, 92, when I first went there, I was 32. I had a bit of experience. I'd been to a few wars and done some big stories, but, it was a big, big deal. And as you said, Paul, it was a war that was close to home. It was very, for me, it felt like our war, because it was our continent and our time, and it was identifiable.
I think if I can just come in here and well, firstly, Jeremy, we interviewed for the book, and he was a wonderful interviewee and very generous with his time. I think you're right. In a sense, I read literally thousands of newspaper articles that were written by journalists. And at the beginning, in 1992, there was an attempt to explain what was happening, why it was happening. And as time went on, and there were very many journalists who were there that were relatively inexperienced. They maybe didn't even understand the complex political dynamics behind it. But somehow the politics got lost. And what was ended up being reported was, massacre after massacre without necessary context. And I think, Bosnia was a complex conflict to explain in your 500 words or however many words you had. And I think that was one thing that really struck me about reading some of the kind of foreign reporting from Sarajevo, how the politics almost seemed to disappear from the story after 6 months or a year.
Ed Vujami? We're unmuting you. You have to.
Sorry, Lara, I didn't catch the name of the person you were saying.
Oh, Ed Vujami.
Thank you, Lara. Am I on? Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Echoing Jeremy. Wow. If only this really was a room instead of fucking cyberspace. Although we probably would be so drunk by now, the whole thing would fall apart. I think it's terribly important. But I want to actually request a question for Paul about this crucial point he made, actually, which all our other contributions are sort of steering towards, about the narrative on the ground and what you, Paul, called the political. narrative? That'll be my question because there's nothing more boring than old war correspondents pretending they're asking a question and actually all they're doing is blathering on, especially to you young students. And I think for you good people, it's terribly important to heed what Paul was talking about Susan Sontag's Godot of the Sarajevo String Quartet, because the thing about war, reporting war, is so much happens which is not the fighting. So actually 95% of the time was not actually what we're talking about in terms of getting shot at and shelled and all the rest of the shit. But, it's fear, it's alcohol, it's fornication, it's just boredom, it's getting on with things. And I think part of the sort of the way of reporting Bosnia and Sarajevo in particular properly was just to be part of it all. I mean, some of those, Paul says concerts. I mean, these were literally underground. There was a wonderful series of very bad rock and roll concerts called Rock Under Siege, with extremely dangerous and damaging homemade alcohol and generated electricity, after which we would go back to work next day looking and feeling our best, but so also with the soldiers who'd come down from the trenches to be there, and some of them even to play. This is absolutely essential to reporting the siege, was to be part of that. I decided to write a book about musical war after the Sarajevo String Quartet aforementioned was reduced to a trio because the cellist was killed on his way to a rehearsal. And I'll never forget the Serbs. They were shelling the theater, and they were trying to play Haydn. And at one point, the shell got so close to the theater that the viola player's stand fell over, and there was this awful moment. What do we do? And he just replaced his stand, and the score, and the leader of the quartet called the number of the bar, 49, and the trio played on like, fuck you, we're trying to play Haydn, will you please leave us alone for a minute? And I think it's very important for you good young people to sort of understand that, 95% of war reporting, particularly in a place like Sarajevo, and even more so in a place like Mexico now, where 3 times the number of people have been killed in a country where kind of the football league works perfectly well. People go to market, to mass, universities are good. 95% of the time is not fighting, but it is war. So that's just a point. And of course, it's all, it's all about kind of good luck, bad luck. It's completely wacky. Kenneth mentioned the EBU. There was a lady there called Stephanie Sluka who somehow hooked the place up to the Pittsburgh landline. For those of us who, a Pittsburgh landline, for those of us who went at the Holiday Inn, because the Guardian was too bloody mean to put us up there, they had us in a B&B, which is separated from the front line by a lunatic asylum. That it was all luck. There was an awful lot of luck involved, an awful lot of good luck and bad luck. But all this comes to my question to you, Paul. You talk about the narrative on the ground and the narrative, the political narrative, and Jeremy made this very good point about how we should perhaps pay more attention to the lies and indeed the sort of prescient fake news that was coming out of the drivel that people like Carrington, Owen, Mitterrand, and others were spouting at the time. And I think it's very important this for you good young people, don't let anyone for a start tell you that war reporting is heroic. If anything, it's anti-heroic. And that's crucial. If anyone tries to sort of lord it over you, I'm the war correspondent, I've got such a big one, and here's my helmet and my flak jacket, please switch him off, press mute, go and talk to somebody else. That's one point. And the reason for that, Paul, is this. Look, we learned many things in Sarajevo and in Bosnia, but the cruelest thing we learned was our own pointlessness. You young people will hear a lot about the power of the media. And indeed, some of the colleagues and the people who are with us here tonight did some of the best journalism of all of our lifetimes during that bloodletting in Bosnia. What effect did we have? Absolutely fuck all. I found concentration camps in 1992, and 3 years later, a few hundred miles down the road from Venice, the Srebrenica massacre happened in 1995. I mean, you'll hear all about the power of the media, especially now, when everybody's got a mobile phone and so on. But Paul, this is what I'm driving at. You know, what impact did the narrative on the ground have on the political impact? I would suggest absolutely nothing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's, sorry, I think that's why it's such a problematic case study, because as I said, you know, our sort of fundamental tenet of journalism, we go out, tell the story, and then the world will do something, you know, it'll affect change. But clearly that failed miserably in Bosnia. I mean, Alan Little, you know, famously, I think in 1993, Alan, if I could get it right, said, you know, when and not if Srebrenica falls to the Serbs besieging it, you know, there will be a massacre. And obviously, you know, that was allowed to happen. So I think it's, I mean, the problem though is that what else do? You know, we can't just abandon it as journalists and say, we're not going to cover these stories. I think that's the kind of really crux of the question that we've got to think about. You know, is it the journalist's job to change government opinion, or is it the journalist's job to put that information out there so that what other stakeholders are interested in trying to affect change can use that information to lobby and to push forward? You know, journalism plays a very important role in that, but I think we're damned by both sides. I think very often, we're damned because we do too much, or we're being accused of doing too much, and we're damned of accused of doing too little. And I think, you know, in many ways, journalism is the sort of don't shoot the messenger. Journalism can become the easy target for a lot of other people. You know, obviously, even at the end of the siege, to an extent, journalists, you know, at the beginning, we obviously were welcomed with very much open arms, because I think Bosnians genuinely believed that if you know, how could you not intervene if people told your story about the horrors that were happening in Bosnia? But obviously that didn't happen. So by the end of the conflict, you know, a lot of the time, I think Western journalists were seen as, you know, a symbol of the failure of the West to intervene, and therefore, you know, we did quite rightly come in for a certain amount of criticism, you know, from within people in Sarajevo. So I think it's difficult, and I think, you know, sadly, you know, the conflicts that have gone on afterwards, again, you know, when we've produced clear and indefutable evidence of human rights abuse and war crimes, and governments have chosen not to act on that. But I think we have to keep doing it. I think we can't abandon that mission, and I think we can't give up on it, as it were. We have to keep on doing it, even if, you know, because at least the world can't say it didn't know. The world can say we don't care, we're indifferent, we don't give a shit, but they can't say we didn't know.
Kenneth, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on one thing that Paul said about the growing cynicism towards 1994, certainly 1995, towards foreign journalists. We do touch on in the, I mean, we discuss in the book how, you know, cameras will be lined up outside the Holiday Inn waiting for someone to be shot. Because now this isn't because necessarily of the cynicism of the journalists on the ground, it's because of the cynicism of the editors of their newspapers or photo agencies, or that they were asking for this, that this is what they want from the war in Bosnia. They don't want complex stories about the politics of the city or the politics of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They want shots of people being sniped on the ground. And we do, at one of our chapters, one of the latter chapters, deals with the growing cynicism that there was within the city for the foreign correspondents, because they were seen almost as voyeurs, actually. And while many of them were trying to do the best they could to enlighten the world as to what was happening in Sarajevo, they were often dismissed. So of course the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Douglas Hurd, I remember a comment he made about British journalists in Sarajevo, and he referred to them as the Something Must Be Done Club. That they were political activists more than journalists. And that's how they were cast, actually, by the British government. They weren't there telling a story objectively, they were campaigning for international intervention. I don't know if Paul wants to add to that, because of course he also
let's move on. We've got a few people still with their hand up. It'd be good to get a couple more questions if we still have time, Lara.
Yeah, we can take a few more minutes. I'm going to go in the order mostly that it received. I have some messages in the chat that are now, people are raising their hands. So I'm going to go from Alan to Aida, and then David, Simon, and Abdallah. And that will probably take the remainder of the time. Alan? Maggie?
Have you unmuted, Alan?
Yeah, I'm trying to. There we go.
There we go. Oh,
How am I? Can you hear me now?
yes. Hello,
Okay.
Alan.
Good. Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Jeremy said about how we would report it differently if we came to it with the experience that we've accrued in the last 30 years. And I would report it differently too, but I think in a different way to Jeremy. I think because I was doing mostly radio, I did quite a lot of the politics at the time. And I would now, I think a lot of our coverage was dominated by the fact that we were fighting a culture war with our desks in London or New York or Paris or wherever, because the diplomatic circuit and wanted to hear stories that confirmed that this was indeed a war of ancient ethnic hatreds and that all sides were equally guilty. And that was the most comfortable interpretation. That was the prevailing interpretation. And we knew it wasn't the case. We could see every day that something else was happening. And it started for me in Croatia even. But even before I went to Sarajevo in the spring of 1992, reporting from northern Bosnia, where you could see municipality by municipality, a carefully organized campaign that came to be known as ethnic cleansing. And I remember being in a sports hall in Split where busloads of women and children from Bosnia were arriving and with none of the men, and interviewing a lot of the women, finding out what had happened to them, and learning that the whole populations had been rounded up, the men separated from the women and children, and the women and children simply expelled from the territories that their families had lived on for many generations. And then I would hear my own report being introduced in London by a newsreader saying, hundreds of women and children from Bosnia have been arriving in the Croatian city of Split after fleeing the fighting. And I would ring my desk and say they didn't flee fighting. There wasn't any fighting. They were rounded up at gunpoint and kicked off their land. But they didn't want to hear that. And for 3 years in Bosnia, more than 3 years in Bosnia, we fought that war against that prevailing cultural assumption that somehow Balkan peoples are genetically or congenitally or culturally predisposed to mutual slaughter every couple of generations. And so we were fighting against that all the time. So there was an awful lot of politics in what we were doing. What I wish I'd done now with retrospect is a lot of the kind of work that I think Paul was doing, which I've come to admire much more, Paul, if I may say so, as I've got older, the sort of work that you were doing, documenting the resilience of the city and the ways in which people adapted and learned to live and kept hold of the values that mattered to them. And because we do some of that. Yeah, I did do some of that. I did do a bit of that, but not as much as Paul, and not as creatively and as inventively and with as much insight as Paul showed then. And I think that was an important. I mean, what I tell people now, because we're living through this lockdown, whenever I meet friends in the street who are getting a bit down because of the lockdown, I say, let me tell you what it was like in Sarajevo. No this, no that, no Netflix box sets to get you through the despairing evenings. But people still went to the theatre. They still needed that connection. People risked their lives to go and see a live performance in some candlelit basement. And Paul documented a lot of that. And I think I tended to see it as the soft side of the story and not the, and I wish if I did do some of it. I didn't, when I think, this has been a quite bittersweet experience for me this evening, because I find myself regretting an awful lot of not so much what I did, but what I didn't do. But most of all, I regret that we had to fight that culture war, not just with the British Foreign Office, not just with the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, but with our own desks. And the overwhelming assumption that when you found an atrocity on one side, they wanted the balancing atrocity on the other side. Yeah, they wanted to be reassured they were right in their assumption that all sides were equally guilty, and they were catastrophically, tragically wrong. That's my big regret.
Yeah, and I think sadly we're still seeing that today. Reporting in, let's take America. Look at how can you have a narrative like that can't absolutely dismiss one side's. Anyway, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And thank you very much, Ron. I really appreciate that. I mean, for me, it's been interesting, just as on a personal level with my own archive, because when I was making pictures during the war, I was making them predominantly for the editorial market, for magazines, for kind of relatively immediate publication. So I was looking for a kind of dramatic picture. And then when I did the book that Alan very kindly wrote a fantastic essay for, which was 10 years later, I was looking for quieter pictures that were more still photographic, but were more kind of documentary. And now I'm going back and revisiting the archive almost as a piece of ethnography, because it's very interesting looking at, who's in the picture, what are they wearing, how are they carrying food, how are they carrying water and things like that. And for some people, it's the only image of them during that period. So it's a very much more of a historic perspective on it. So I think it was very interesting from that point of view, working with the book as well, just revisiting, as you said, this period and how significant and how unique it is, I think, as a sort of laboratory of human experience, what happened to people there and how they, as I said, in many ways, they used all sorts of forms of cultural resistance as well as armed resistance to survive the siege.
Yeah,
Lowe, do you want to?
If I can just add to that, Paul, I think one of the really interesting things about doing this project, but also other related projects, one of which is creating a permanent exhibition within the established Besieged Sarajevo exhibition, which will focus on the role of foreign correspondents in Sarajevo. And we collected a huge amount of physical material, old cameras, sat phones, laptops, and so forth. But one of the interesting parts of that was that many photojournalists sent me their images that they'd taken from within Sarajevo. And I asked them, these have to be images that feature photojournalists. And they don't necessarily need to be at work, they can be at play. And there were some incredibly revealing photographs that you would never be able to sell to Newsweek or Time or the Sunday Times, whoever you were selling those images to. But we've collected, I think, between the two of us, some really intimate and interesting images of what it was like to report the siege. Not necessarily, on front lines, but just reporting the kind of daily grind, if you like, of reporting the siege.
Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Alan, for your comments. And we are still fighting the culture wars inside the university, so you have no idea. Aida Cherkez, please. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I also covered the war as a foreign correspondent and as a local, which was a really unique position because I was with one leg here and with the other leg there. So I have this split personality to this day, being a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of real Sarajevan and a little bit of a foreign correspondent. And I just have to tell Ed, you are being, and all of you who think this way, you are being way too modest unnecessarily. You know very well that Auschwitz was discovered in 1945 when they marched in, when the soldiers marched in. Ed, Ron, and everybody else who marched into Omarska and Trnopolje, they marched in 1992. So you have to, and they stopped it. That visit stopped it. So this war would have been much worse if you were not there. And I think that you have actually saved a lot of lives with this, with your reporting. And when I started, I even made a movie about this because this is what I want to tell the world. I really started off because I wanted to help foreign correspondents report from my city, thinking that if the world would know what's going on here, it would stop it. That illusion, that turned out to be an illusion already in 1993, and I wanted to give up. And for a long time, I was kind of depressed and didn't really see the point. And I was complaining to my colleagues, like, I'm really yelling into deaf people's ears. And I could watch how my colleagues who came to cover this war are slowly getting into conflicts with their own desks. And I was sitting there and listening to these arguments, exactly what Alan was saying. because their reports did not confirm what the desks wanted to hear. They didn't confirm those pictures. And I was watching these arguments and thinking, with every word, this person is actually becoming one of us. They don't really understand. But you kept going, and eventually Sarajevans do recognize you. When I speak to Sarajevans today, they know your names and they recognize you as Sarajevans. Maybe you don't know that, but they do. And they mention you very often and very fondly. But you have to know that maybe we did not, with our reporting, not only from Bosnia, but in general, change the course of history, although I think we did. And maybe we can't stop massacres and we can't stop wars, but at least later, if you can only present your report, you can only tell the world, put the information out there, and whoever wants to consume the information, whoever wants to know knows, who doesn't want to know won't know. But here's what you're doing with this: you're making the information available, which means that ignorance is no longer an alibi. Ignorance becomes a choice. And that's something everybody individually has to deal with. And I think that's a great mission. Just to turn this ignorance into a choice is really worth it. And I think that should be an inspiration for younger journalists. Don't set the bar too high. I want to stop the war. I just want to, present it to you, take it or leave it. But if you leave it, it's your choice and you're an asshole. That's it.
Thanks, Aida.
Aida.
Aida, I could tell you a funny story, Aida. Aida helped me try to register the first ever car imported into the independent country of Bosnia. It's a funny story, so please, if you'll indulge me a second. I flew into Sarajevo with Tom Stoddard in June 1992 on a Hercules. We landed at the airport, we flew straight back out again because we had to get our film out. And we landed in Split, and we bought a Lara limousine, a Plava limousina in Split from a small ads of the local newspaper. And we threw away the number plates because it was identifying it as Split. And we drove into Sarajevo over the mountains. As Jeremy said, it took about 3 days over these dirt roads. And we got to the last checkpoint by the airport on the main road. And we'd heard from Ian Trainer, the Guardian reporter, that you could either go as fast as possible down the main Sniper Alley to the Holiday Inn and risk it as it was more open, or you could try and take this back road, the supposed back road that might be safer, but then you might get lost and you might get waylaid and you might go take a wrong turning. So we decided to take the main road in, and this last checkpoint, the Serb soldier kind of waved us on with a sort of a smile, like, "Who are you crazy people?" And we set off driving as fast as we could. And we got about 200 or 300 yards down, or maybe a kilometer down Sniper Alley, and a guy in camouflage fatigues jumped out in front of us with a Kalashnikov. But stop, stop, stop. And we were like, "Oh my God, what's happening? What's going on? Oh, is it an ambush? Are we going to be attacked?" And we screamed to a halt, and he tapped on the window and we wound it down. And he said in really good English, "Are you people from England?" And we were like, "Yes." "How do you know?" "You're driving on the wrong side of the road. This is in Bosnia. You're on the wrong side of the road." And so we then had that car and we sold it to Kurt Schork at Reuters, but it didn't have any papers and it didn't have any number plates. So we kept on getting stopped by the police because they were like, "Have you stolen this car?" So we went to Aida, who at the time was working at the TOBIH press office, to give us some papers that we then took to the Opština Stari Grad to try to register the car. And we went and said, "Well, we've got this car, we've imported it to Bosnia, we'd like to get some legal papers for it." And we were the first people ever to try to register a car in the newly independent country of Bosnia. And that car ended up being driven around with TO temporary armory plates on it by Kurt and many other people from the Reuters team. So sorry to give that little bit of a personal anecdote there. But thanks to Aida and the amazing work that she did over the years with both with the Bosnian army initially and then with AP obviously afterwards.
Kenneth, do you have any comments?
No, I think we should move on. There's a few people.
Okay. Thank you, Aida. We could have a very long webinar we would probably take the whole weekend of things you've done for the people who were present on this call. That will be for another day. David, thank you for patiently waiting. Maggie? David?
Yes, I would thank you for taking my question, and thank you for the extremely interesting discussion, and brings back a lot of memories. I'm not a journalist. I was a U.S. government analyst during the war and spent quite a bit of time in Sarajevo and in Bosnia. My question is from, I was also one who took a trip from Sarajevo to Mostar over the mountains. And my question relates to that. One of the trips we took, group I was with went through the tunnel underneath the airport. We left the city through the tunnel rather than over the roads. And I won't bore you with all the details of how Zelajic was along and some other people. And Zelajic got into a big pissing contest with General Rose about various things. And the thing was, a lot of people got involved in this. We get to the tunnel, and there was an interesting choreography among the soldiers, the civilians, and the politicians, kind of over who went in what order. You have people going one way through the tunnel, and then they stop at people coming back the other way through the tunnel. As the French military ran the airport, there were some Bosnian soldiers, really rather just grunts as far as we could tell, kind of directing traffic. And my question off of that is, in your reporting and your discussions of the resiliency of the city, which is a really good point, and it's something that very much worth attention. What were the impressions you had of the negotiations that took place daily between civilians, military, their kind of local officials, and the international reporters, the NGOs who were fighting with each other over office space and furniture? I remember that real well. And the foreign diplomats over who got what and over who could go where. It wasn't always as nasty between Zelajic and Rhodes on that day. Sometimes it was quite congenial. Often it was constructive. I was wondering if Paul or Kenneth or any of the rest of you who were there had comments on sort of the way citizens, politicians, military, foreigners sort of navigated the daily necessities of surviving the war.
Okay, let me just talk to that. Paul can come in after I've finished. The stories actually of journalists leaving Sarajevo and reporting from elsewhere are also worth documenting. So Jeremy earlier on talks about his own experience going and taking a very long time via Jablanica over to Mostar. We actually intended at the beginning of this project to write a book about reporting the Bosnian War, but what happened is that we ended up with it was kind of nicely encapsulated within this reporting of the siege, reporting of this one particular city that was besieged. And we didn't actually deal with all of those many very interesting stories of how journalists managed to leave Sarajevo and go elsewhere, to report from places like Bihać, to report from places like Mostar. But we actually garnered quite a significant amount of interview data about those trips. And we do intend to do something with that. We do intend to write, whether it's an academic paper or whether it's a kind of short book, but about the reporting of the foreign reporting of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I guess one of the, in a sense, tragedies of the focus entirely being on Sarajevo, particularly in those early days, was that everything else that was going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina went unreported. So what was going on in Visegrad, let's say, or until Ed got there in Penny Marshall, what was going on in Prijedor in April or May 1992. Jeremy's story from Mostar was really the important one because it was very, very difficult to get in behind lines to get to Mostar to tell that story. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of side issue, but we would like to document those stories as well, and maybe to get those out there for people to read. Paul, I don't know if you want to come in. I should add at this stage that I'm a historian and wasn't actually in Sarajevo during the siege. Of course, I know the city extremely well now, but Paul was in the city during the siege. He's maybe better placed to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't really focus too much on that aspect of it, David, in terms of negotiations, because I think the two perspectives we took, and I think just to give people an idea, you know, I hope Kenneth doesn't mind me saying this, but we kind of more or less ended up splitting the writing of the book into two halves. And the first half of the book, which is the historic narrative and the day-by-day narrative and the infrastructure setting up, Kenneth wrote and researched the bulk of that. And then the second half of the book, which is more about the journalistic processes, if you like, and what it was like to be reporting in the field and the daily life of journalists, and some of that contextual sense of why this is an important moment in the history of journalism. And then some of the ethical questions, I wrote that side. And obviously it was really interesting between the two of us because I had that lived experience of being there. And so there were things that I think I could bring. I mean, I'm also, and these days I am actually a historian because I studied history back at university, and it's kind of strange to me that in many ways I've kind of come full circle now, because now I'm mostly a writer and an academic as well. But I think what it gave us was a really powerful combination, because Kenneth's obviously got that fantastic political knowledge and historical knowledge, contextual knowledge of the region and of the country. And then I was able to bring that sort of personal experience as well to give it that authenticity, if you like. But yeah, so we didn't really focus too much on those kind of minutiae of everyday twists and turns of the actual conflict itself, David, because we were more interested in many ways in how the journalistic narrative was put together.
Thank you, Paul. Simon?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm not a journalist and I'm not a Bosnian, but I feel great empathy with many people here tonight, and I do know a few of you, and it's a pleasure to see you. And I drafted some questions and sent them in earlier, having no idea how the narrative would go tonight, and not having yet read the book, but I did buy it today with the lovely 30% off at Bloomsbury, and I look forward to that. It's been very, very fascinating conversation, because you've touched on many of my points. What I was doing in the time I was in Sarajevo during the war was producing some of those concerts that Ed rather disparagingly called bad, because I was actually doing the audio production on some of them, and I thought they were quite good, especially the second Rock Under Siege concert. But rather like the young journalists who found themselves there, able to sort of develop that opportunity, I was with a young aid organisation that hadn't really worked in global sort of catastrophe before, but found itself driving a double-decker bus in the area on its way to Romania, really, and then drove along Sniper's Alley and found itself having a fantastic reputation with young people in Sarajevo. And we ended up being an organization who ended up with premises in the University of Sarajevo, doing some fascinating stuff with music, all kinds of things there, but supporting those very festivals, the Rock Under Siege Festival, supporting Tamna Strana Disneyland Festival, founding the Jazz Festival and things. And so I look at it as an outsider. I had all these kind of questions, and many of them have been the kind of narrative of this conversation, but also a couple of observations. You know, a little bit of this is, at what point did we all go native? Okay, and Paul, you're still in Sarajevo. I met you there a couple of years ago briefly, and it's still a huge part of my life. Ed ended up giving, evidence at The Hague and all this kind of thing. It changed our lives, and it changed my life. I have a freezer full of cevapcici in Buxton in Derbyshire. Okay, so what does this mean 20 odd years on? And what I find really interesting is I go back to asking this as a journalistic question. You showed a photograph earlier, and funnily enough, it's one before I knew what the presentation would be that I mentioned in when I drafted my questions earlier, of young Nermin Divovic, who was shot, 7-year-old lad, shot through the head in front of 2 APCs with 2 UN firefighters there. The one on the right-hand side of that photograph, that UN firefighter, is Trevor Gibson. I don't know if you know Trevor's subsequent story. He's a Grammy Award-winning record producer, and if it wasn't for Trevor, Bruce Dickinson's lead singer, Iron Maiden's lead singer, Bruce Dickinson, wouldn't have gone and played that concert in Sarajevo. And Trevor was on to me last year about how we could continue supporting the Divovic family because they're in trouble. Look at the other iconic images. Look at Fikret Alic outside Omarska with the barbed wire, and the confrontation of whether that was fake news or not that was championed and proven it wasn't. But look at the fact that his story has been retold, or his story has been continued and told 20 years later. What we owe to history a little bit is not just reporting it then, but reporting what happens next. Because some of these continue to be horror stories, but some of them are incredibly positive. So I had the privilege of working with some young people during the war who are now some of Bosnia's greatest musicians. They include Dubioza Collective, they include Amira Medunjanin, and those kind of things. You know, we've talked about the importance of culture in that context. So I guess my question is a really simple one. At what point do you go native, and what's the difference between a journalist and a humanitarian?
Listen, that's a really interesting question, and I'll let Paul pick up on that. Look, one of the criticisms of the journalists in Sarajevo, particularly those that have been there for a long time and had been based in the Holiday Inn, was that the Holiday Inn had had an institutionalizing effect on them. So they were reporting from within a besieged city, and of course, it's natural if you're sharing. I mean, they weren't entirely sharing. Those that were staying in the Holiday Inn had, you know, not all the time, but they had water, light, electricity, they had food. And that wasn't the case, of course, for the ordinary citizens of Sarajevo. But they were nevertheless there, they were within the city, and they were reporting on their experiences. And, you know, there is, in a sense, it's a really interesting question. When does the journalist go native? When does that happen? And to what extent do they then become campaigners rather than journalists? Now, there are many journalists who, for example, were having relationships with local women or men who later married them, who have made their lives there. So, yeah, I mean, it is a very interesting question. And I think I'll leave it to Paul, who has more experience of both than I, to answer.
Yeah, full disclosure, I'm married to a Sarajevan, as indeed several other people in the audience I think are as well. Yeah, no, I mean it's always very difficult because, you know, when you're covering sort of these sorts of really powerful and very traumatic stories, you know, you're constantly trying to walk that tightrope between maintaining. I don't agree with the idea of objectivity, but maintaining a sense of context and perspective, but also remaining a sense of your own humanity. And I think, you know, what we're trying to do is communicate, you know, essentially, you know, journalism, you know, it's a cliche, but we are the eyes and ears of the world in that sense. We are going out into the world. We're going to places that other people won't go to because they're dangerous and they're difficult. And we are trying to shine a light on injustice and abuse and war crimes. And we're also trying to do that in a way that has a powerful effect on the audience. You know, we are trying to create, you know, we're good at our jobs, and our jobs very often is create a powerful emotional impact on the audience. So I think, you know, identifying with the people that you're working with is really important in journalism, because otherwise there's a danger that they just become a faceless sort of cipher. And you could argue that actually, you know, a lot of coverage of the majority world of Africa and other countries has fallen into that trap of, you know, not really identifying the people that are being reported on, the subjects of reporting, as actual human beings with agency and with their ability to change their own destinies and so on. I think the whole issue around the coverage of migrants and refugees very much falls into that category, that generally speaking, they're seen as this sort of mass of faceless humanity. I think in Sarajevo, because we could connect with people on a very personal level and spend time with them and stay with them. And as I said earlier on, something like Charlotte Eager's example, you know, where she was able to follow the life of one family over weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months. You know, because Sarajevo was unusual because we stayed there for so long. And although some journalists came and went and just stayed for a brief period of time, the core of the reporters that covered the story lived there off and on for months and months and months, if not years. So we had a very strong personal connection with the story, but that also, and with the people of the city. And, you know, as I said to you before at the beginning, you know, I often compared Sarajevo with Edinburgh, you know, a city of 300,000 people, sort of surrounded by hills, full of culture, a capital city of a country of its own. And there were lots of historical and cultural links between Sarajevo and Edinburgh before the war as well, with things like Mira Puravatra and the artists that have been there, and so on and so forth. But you know, if you can imagine Edinburgh being put under siege, how would you cover that story? How would you respond to that? So I think it's almost impossible not to identify with the people that you're photographing and filming and interviewing if you're spending that long there. And I think that is the right thing to do. But you still want to temper that with a sense of context and a sense of perspective. And you know, I would also say that I think, as Alan said, and as Jeremy said earlier on, you know, we were fighting a narrative that was being put out by governments that was very powerful, but was not the narrative of what we were seeing on the ground. And I think that's one of the key things about the conflict in the former Yugoslavia in general, but particularly in Bosnia. And I think it's played out in other conflicts as well. Clearly, you know, that political governments, political parties have agendas which are not necessarily humanitarian. They may purport to be, but very often they're not. They are political, geopolitical agendas, and they're not really concerned with the fate of individual people on the ground. They're concerned with their larger issues of party politics and staying in power, staying in government, you know, to be honest.
Thank you, Paul. We'll take the final two questions. Abdullah, then Edin.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Paul, and Kenneth and everyone. This is a good chance to speak a little bit about my experience with Sarajevo, how I'm glued to this city. Actually, I didn't cover the war in 1992 till 95 because I was covering the conflict in South Lebanon. And in 93, I was planning to go, but a mini war erupted in South Lebanon, 7 days war. So I didn't have the chance to cover the war. Until 1995, I went to Sarajevo and started documenting the massacres as a documentary maker. And I was young, and then I returned back in 1999. And I did the documentary. I wanted to ask Jeremy Boehm also about, because I had the crossroad with him, but we don't know each other closely. Many events happened in the same time, especially when his fixer was killed in 2000 in Lebanon, and we were the same place. Actually, also, I want to ask Kenneth and Paul about the fallen, the journalists who were killed in the Bosnian War. Is there any tribute, dedication in the book about them? And also I know that both of them, they were involved in many projects to commemorate the journalists and the city of Sarajevo, like a museum or even a museum in the Holiday Inn. So is there any projects to create a memorial for the fallen in Sarajevo to be maybe close to the museum or to the Holiday Inn itself? This is my question. And between brackets, if Kenneth, excuse me to mention this, we worked together, and Paul, on an episode about the Holiday Inn. I'm a senior producer at Al Jazeera Media Network, and I have a series called War Hotels, and of course it continued soon. So I was very, very honored to work with Kenneth and Paul on this episode, because we couldn't put all the stories of the Holiday Inn in 26 minutes. So I'm happy that they have this book and maybe a future book. So this is my question, actually. Is there any plan or any will after this COVID crisis to create a memorial for the fallen?
Yeah, so let me pick up on that firstly, Abdullah. Paul, you can, I'm sure, talk about the fallen and perhaps the commemoration, for example, of Kurt Schork that exists in Sarajevo. But so one of the things that we've been doing, and I have to mention my good friend, Boba Lizdek, who's been a fantastic partner. We created a foundation in Bosnia we gathered basically items from a lot of the people that we interviewed. And I have to thank Alan Little, Jeremy Bowen, for donating material for the exhibition at the History Museum. But I have to give a special mention to Dave Rust. Dave Rust is a CNN cameraman who is an avid collector. He collects everything. Even if it's kind of, water bottles that Obama had been drinking out of, when the event is finished, Dave will grab the water bottle and keep it in his personal archive. So Dave has donated a very significant amount of material to us for that exhibition. It will be a single exhibition or a standalone exhibition in the History Museum, but then it will be kind of embedded into or incorporated into the wider Besieged Sarajevo exhibition at the History Museum. But one story I must tell you is that when I was negotiating with Dave which items he might be willing to give me, it turned out that he had something I'd been looking for a long time. And that was the guest book, the original guest book from the Holiday Inn that covered the period between 1984 and 1992. Now, I've been looking for this while I was researching the Holiday Inn, and I couldn't find this one guest book, Kniga Utisaka, couldn't find it. And the people that worked at the hotel told me that, well, it must have disappeared during the siege, but it turned out that Dave had been asked to smuggle it out of the hotel, and he agreed to give it to me. And it arrived by courier one day, and I opened it and I saw that the first person who had signed this book was Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the first guest, who was given the Zlatni Kluj, the golden key to the Holiday Inn on the 6th of October, 1983. He was the first person to sign the guest book. And I took the guest book to Sarajevo and I gave it to Hajrudin Rovčan in Hajro, who'd worked at the hotel. He's now the general manager of the Hotel Holiday, recently retired. But I gave it to him, and he was overwhelmed that this book still existed, that this guest book still existed. And it was a brilliant moment, actually, to be able to bring something back to the hotel and to the city that should be in this city. It shouldn't be anywhere else. It should be there. So the guest book will be part of that kind of broader exhibition as well. So, I mean, there was a comment earlier on about, the book documenting a specific period, but we're not just documenting a specific period. Actually, we're continuing to work and try and bring to light some of the stories that are contained in the book, 25 years later. And the book actually is just the basis for a much broader project that Paul and I are involved in, that involves the History Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina and many local partners as well. So, but I'll let Paul add his tuppence worth to that.
Yeah, no, I think, certainly as Kenneth said, we work very closely with the Historical Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina, formerly the Museum of the Revolution, and we've done I've worked with them on a lot of different projects, but we're definitely working with them on the designing of the Besieged Sarajevo exhibition, and hoping that some of my photography is going to form a pretty substantial part of that reworking, and also we'll have part of the part of the story we've created, and the incredible collection that Kenneth and Bogan have put together of memorabilia and of artifacts. And within that, we'll definitely commemorate those that sadly lost their lives in not just the Siege of Sarajevo, but in the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Because we always have to remember that, that people do eventually, people do lay down their lives for covering these stories. Absolutely. Do we want to take that last question, Lara, from Edin?
Last question from Edin. Yeah.
It's been waiting a long time. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Greetings from Wales.
Wales.
Right. Fantastic presentation tonight. Is really enjoyable. It threw me back some years back. I was 15 years old when war started in Bosnia, from Sarajevo, right in the city center, in the Cengić Vila area. Paul probably knows the area. It's made massive impression on me in the life. Now it's good and bad, you know, with the trolls. I used to see loads of guys because initially I started to work for Bosnian Red Cross, delivering Red Cross messages, going from HQ down to Red Cross offices in Cengičvila area. Used to see Jeremy Bowen quite a lot on my dangerous tracks in beginning in June, in July 1992. He looked much younger then. And I used to,
we all did. We all did.
We all, yeah. And I used to see that white BBC soft skin voxel, and I thought it was really shabby. I was really shocked that BBC gave him something like that. So they found it in a local scrapyard or something. But later on,
because you ever didn't see our Plava Limousina.
I
that
never
was even
did
worse.
actually. No. But I used to remember the white one, and then I used to remember seeing Martin Bell as well initially, a few times in his white suits, and I thought he's a crazy guy, you know, being in white suits, a big target for the snipers. But luckily, nothing happened, and yeah, it was strange times. It's now in Wales, very similar, like you guys are saying, loads of culture war now with the media as well, especially what's happening now with Brexit, fake news and everything. And I would like just to add on a thing that Simon Glenn said earlier on, mentioning Trevor Gibson and the firefighters in Sarajevo. I was their interpreter during the during the war. I initially was, like I said, for Bosnian Red Cross, and then I got with them, with John Jordan, and stayed on, and I made a great escape with the Trevor in 1995 from Sarajevo. Took us, I think, probably about 17 hours to reach Zagreb. Luckily, didn't go through Sierra 4 checkpoint, through the airport, Mount Enigman, all the way down to Mostar, Metkovic, and up there. So I was on a concert as well with Iron Maiden. And yeah,
amazing.
And then when I was interpreter for UN, obviously we had access for you know, UN Far EMS, we had access to BBC News. We used to listen to BBC World News in the night. And what Alan Little said, and other guys also mentioned, that culture media, they were reporting one thing, and obviously me being there, and then I had the feeling then later on that the news would be sugarcoating it on the desk, that they would totally make it like, well, it's everyone's fault and everything. And that's what, you know, Paul said that, you know, loads of journalists had that free reins of Sarajevo, because you guys were loved. You were welcome, because you were almost our messengers to the world in those days, to show the truth, what's happening, because obviously phone lines were cut off, and you know, we had, you know, technology in those days. Bosnian TV didn't have satellites and live reporters, and then loads of people believed in you, that you'll bring us that intervention. You will be helping us to stop this. But then obviously now my understanding is the desks were changing that narrative. And then towards the later, you know, I stayed there until 95. Loads of them people, local people, were seeing you as, oh, you guys were just on a jolly here. You were just for good photographs, or you were just waiting for, you know, innocent casualties to be shot and then, you know, shown. And then I'm not saying that the trust was lost in you guys, but I think that expectations of a world media was slowly diminishing. Because my understanding is why now, because up there, yeah, it was doctored. It was like sugarcoating later on, and you know. So my question is, I don't know, is Alan still or Jeremy still online? But how did you guys feel, or even Paul or whoever, how did you guys feel once you've, you know, with your desks? Did you feel that frustration and say, well, hang on a minute, I'm giving you one side of the story, I'm telling you how it is on the ground, because I've seen it, they've seen it, and then desk changes that narrative and sugarcoats it? You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks like Alan and Jeremy are not with us anymore, but definitely that happened. It not so much to I didn't experience that directly because I was working a slightly different way and with a different way with editors and so on. But we do have there's an incident that Chris Morris, the Time photographer, narrates in, and we include it in the book, where there was an occasion that you may remember in January 1994 when 6 children were killed in Alapashna by a Serbian rocket that landed while they were out playing sledging in the snow. And they were they were angelic kids who were very badly injured and killed by that. And Chris had photographed that and sent his film back to Time. And that night on the television, he recalled watching, I'm just reading from the book now, Bill Clinton giving a speech in which he said that we've examined, there's plenty of aid getting in, there's no humanitarian crisis. And he said he completely lost it, and he went to the PTT and he called Time and asked to be patched directly through to the White House correspondent and saying, I've just seen children with their faces ripped off by shrapnel. You have to go and tell the president, that he's wrong. So yes, I mean, there was a lot of frustration amongst the journalistic community that we were telling this. We were on the ground. We had. We could see clearly what was happening in front of us. We could see the situation, and we were reporting on that, trying to feed that back. But then it was being, as you said, it was being spun and often ignored and negated by the editorial line of the publications, and by a lot of the time being the true horror of the violence was being censored as well in terms of the what would be published, what would get on air. There were Martin Bell had a lot of arguments about the amount of blood that should be allowed to be shown, for example, on on domestic television and so on. So yes, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. But I felt, I mean that period around when Nermin was killed, I distinctly remember, because it was when the UN brought in the French anti-sniper team to try to prevent the sniper attacks in Grbavica, and that became a big story because it was one of the few times the UN had taken action. And one of the horrific ironies of that, of Nermin being killed, is he was killed right in front of a UN armored personnel carrier, literally yards away from them. And I distinctly remember going down one day to photograph that because it was basically one intersection where this was happening all the time. And there was a line of photographers and TV crews waiting because it was a story. It was the big, the UN was intervening and it wasn't working. And I just felt I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to walk away because I felt very, very uncomfortable in that. So yes, I mean, it does ask, you have to ask yourself really difficult questions about why you're there, what are your motivations, what are you trying to do that you're, with what you're doing. And for me, my answer was that I would then go and look for a different story, perhaps a story that wasn't being covered by somebody else. And I think, as Alan said, that's why I ended up covering a lot of the daily life and the cultural life, because I felt that, to me, as a kind of historian, that was a really unique aspect of the conflict that needed to be documented. And that other people were going to the front lines and doing the kind of the violence. I mean, I did cover some of that, but for me, what was really fascinating was how people survived it, the sort of survivor's guide to Sarajevo aspect of the siege, really.
But then
I love. Sorry, but I was just going to say that I love the slightly Welsh twang to your accent every now and again as well.
Yeah.
It's very sweet.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Paul, I mean, there is a difference as well when we were, conducting interviews with journalists. The vast majority of those that we interviewed were invested in the story in quite an emotional way. But there was cynicism as well, Paul, which you have to acknowledge, that there were photographers, journalists who were going there and their only interest was in catching that person being shot. And you can understand the growing cynicism among the citizens of Sarajevo to foreign journalists, which I think, as Edin said, by 1994, 1995, that cynicism had become almost acute, that it wasn't, not every foreign journalist who was reporting from Sarajevo was as invested or knowledgeable about the story as you may have been.
I mean, undoubtedly there were Dateline burglars, people that would fly into the airport, never leave the airport terminal, with the UN, stay on the ground for 30 minutes and then fly back to Ancona and write a whole report as if they'd spent weeks under siege there, for sure. But, you know, having said that, I mean, yes, there were some people that, Kenneth, but I think the majority of the people that covered the story in any depth and who stayed there, and there were an enormous number of people who did that. You know, we were all torn. I mean, Enrique, we've got an amazing quote from Enrique Martí, who took the photograph of Nermin, you know, lying there dead, when he said that when he heard about the Marketplace massacre in the Markale massacre of February 1994, he wasn't there, and he said his first reaction was thinking, fuck, I missed it. That was a really amazing picture, and I wasn't there. And then he thought, oh, hang on a minute, you know, then you realize the importance of what you've seen. And he talked about, you know, having this kind of alter ego that's hungry and competitive to get the picture. But then after that, you reflect on that and you think, well, actually, then, you know, afterwards you think about, yes, I'm a human being and I'm trying to get this image to be published. But at the moment of taking it, you're competitive. You're trying to get, you know, there was a lot of, don't forget, there was competition, you know, between Reuters and AP, for example, you know, to get the story, to get the scoop and so on. So there was competition in Sarajevo, and there always is in journalism, but there's always a tension in there. But on the other hand, you know, at the end of the day, as I said earlier on, I think we are trying to report it as human beings as well as reporters.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think we've reached the end. I don't think I've ever had and go an hour over.
I know, just looking, but we're exactly an hour over, so at least we got it precisely
on. Just a few final comments. You all have the discount flyer. I encourage you to buy the book or to have your library buy the book. It's available, booksellers everywhere. Thank you to the authors and to all of the participants for your wonderful interventions in this wonderful conversation. The fact that over 100 people are still here, I think says that we need to have more events of this type. I would like to flag a related book talk coming up on March 15th at 6 p.m. EST. We're hosting a talk with Elizabeth Becker, and she's going to talk about her book, You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War about Vietnam. It's also a wonderful book. I realize there are a lot of Europeans in the room. I'm happy to see if we can schedule perhaps a lunchtime talk so it's not kind of in the middle of the night for you. Thank you very much, Kenneth. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to everyone who contributed to today's discussion.
Thanks. Simon's just said that Trevor Gibson, who we were just talking about, is actually joined us in the room now.
Joined,
I guess Simon maybe, which is incredible. And Trevor, I've just written an article for the Historical Museum's Journal about Sniper Ali and specifically about Nermin's death. So I'd love to contact you if that's possible at some point. Maybe Simon, you can put me in touch with him. I'd be very interested to talk to you some more about that. But yeah, I mean, just thank you very much for organizing this, Lara. It's been an incredible evening with quite extraordinary response. It was incredible to see all these great friends and colleagues in the room with us and get so fascinated to hear their perspectives as well. So and obviously thank you very much to Kenneth for being with us on this journey.
No, thank you, pleasure. And it was a wonderful evening to bring together so many of the people, so many friends and colleagues, and to have such a wonderful conversation. I know it's lasted 2 hours, which is an awful lot longer than we were expecting, but I think every minute has been worth it. It's been great.
Absolutely, it was incredibly
Thank
rich.
you so much to all.
Bye-bye, thank you all.
Thanks everybody, good night and have a good evening, and thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you.
Vozdra.
Laku noć.
Prijatno.